a senior political analyst. One of the key elements of this, of course, is one of precedent. And albeit that this is ultimately going to be an advisory opinion, as we've been hearing just from Bernard, but also from our previous guest as well, our legal expert, there is no question that this is going to have some sort of ramification for cases going forward.
Absolutely, especially on the parts that will be discussed later and will have to be deliberated on by the court. The aspects of such as the apartheid. Is there a regime of apartheid going on the occupied territories, and what does that mean? Because when that was judged so in the case of South Africa, it had huge ramifications, right? And that goes to the sort of to the nature of what we're witnessing today. Because I'm not sure if you notice, I'm gonna sound maybe anticlimax a bit. Our viewers around the world who've been watching us the past almost 2 decades must be wondering, what is this? I mean, what are we watching? How could Israel's 6 decades occupation be legal? Why are we discussing the illegality of Israel occupation? Can such a system of violence by one people against another people that goes on for decades be legal? Can one country steal the land of another people and settle on it be legal? So why are we discussing it? Why are the Palestinians appealing to the ICJ to get a ruling that is obvious to everyone around the world? We're reporting on it, for God's sakes, every day. It's because of what you just asked. It's because when you set it up in legal terms, when the illegitimate becomes by letter and spirit illegal, then there will be ramifications and implications when other organizations, other countries, such as, take, for example, European Union. If the European Union that has a favorite trade relations with Israel, and now the ICJ came out with a ruling says the occupied territories are illegal occupied, Israel practices an apartheid regime, a crime against humanity against the Palestinians. Would you really want to continue with their preferred trade status with Israel? Would you want to provide it with arms? So this legal precedent as such is hugely important.
I want to ask you about that, because a few days ago we saw a court in the Netherlands which upheld a ruling which said that the Dutch government could not supply parts for F-35 fighters to Israel. Now, Paul Reichler himself, the legal expert we heard just speaking before they broke for the intermission, was calling out the US, saying that the US has repeatedly supported Israel in its actions. Of course, the US is a major supplier of arms to Israel. If the ruling goes against Israel, isn't it incumbent legally, is there not at least an obligation, as you were saying, on those countries who are ostensibly supporting Israel in its actions to stop doing it? And what implications do you think that would have for the US?
It certainly will have ramifications on some more than others, right? Because we're going to see someone like the United States, go as we heard them before with the South African case at the ICJ saying, this is meritless, this is baseless, we don't want to discuss it now, it's counterproductive, it's in fact interfering in our effort to help resolve the Israel-Palestine issue and so on and so forth. But I think the idea that the ICJ would come out a ruling and it will be nuanced, not simply that the 6 decades occupation is illegal, but the fact that apartheid regime, which once again, there's precedence on it on the question of South Africa, crime against humanity, is practiced every day in East Jerusalem, as well as in the West Bank and Gaza and so on and so forth. This will have ramifications across the board. Some countries will be able to withstand it more than others. But some countries have already been taking precautions. For example, the United States has considered, generally speaking, settlements on the West Bank to be illegal. At one point, then, as I said, they start saying they are problematic, and then, they're not helpful, and so on and so forth. But generally speaking, the United States has taken the position that settlements are illegal, and hence, every time they give aid to Israel, they underline that this should not go to the West Bank settlements, and so on and so forth. But de facto, it does. De jure, it does. Because now in the West Bank, there are these illegal Jewish settlements that are directly supported by the Israeli government, directly financed by the Israeli government. There are educational institutions in the settlements that are directly supported by the Israeli government. So this is not just a bunch of Israeli citizens, radicals, extremists, or whatever, taking off and settling in the West Bank. The project of settlement in the West Bank, the bypass roads that we just heard about, the bypass roads, the apartheid roads that Jews can get on, Palestinians cannot get on, the apartheid wall that this court has made a judgment on back in 2004 that it is illegal in the occupied West Bank, right? All of that will have implications on the intermediate and long run.
I want to ask you about that because one of the words that Israel invariably comes back to when it defends itself in cases like this is that these lands are disputed. And therefore, there cannot be no annexation because these lands are under dispute and there needs to be a resolution of that dispute. If there is a result from this court that is in favor of the Palestinian case, in favor of the UNGA that has brought this action, where does that leave Israel's defense of these are disputed lands?
Well, to be clear, and this is actually an important point you raise, this court is not judging whether occupied territories are occupied or disputed. They are occupied. Here, we're not hearing a debate on whether they are disputed or occupied. Israel can make the claim at once, and it does. It makes outrageous claims, huge lies, non-stop for 50-plus years. Because at the United Nations Security Council, on a number of occasions, the nature of Israel's presence on the occupied territories was deemed as occupation. There is no dispute over the fact that Israel occupies the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, except in the minds of certain Israelis, and not all Israelis, of certain Israelis. So Israel makes claims, but those claims are not in line with the international community, with international law, as transpired at the United Nations General Assembly and the United Nations Security Council. What the court is going to be deliberating on, that this occupation, this military occupation, has not gone on for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20, 25, 30, 35. It's gone on for 56 years, and guess what? What we've just heard before in the latest argument by Rector is that Israel intends to make it permanent, that everything about Israel's settlements project that justifies the presence of Israeli military on the occupied territories, everything about that settlement project makes it an annexation de facto and de jure by Israel. And hence this occupation becomes annexation, and hence it's illegal. Right? So it's not the question whether Israel occupies, is whether this occupation is legal for a certain amount of time. What they are showing is that Israel has had and has every intention to prolong this occupation as long as possible, to make it de facto annexation, and hence it is illegal, that you cannot go on occupying another people for over than 5 decades and still say, well, you know, it's just temporary. It might go on for another 50 years, another 100 years, 200 years. It's always temporary. No, this is not temporary because everything about it looks permanent, especially when you move in de facto, by design, communities, Jewish communities on those occupied territories. You confiscate land illegally from Palestinians living on those lands, and you give it to the Jews that are illegally settling there. And you have one generation after another generation now of illegal settlers. And when they showed us the diagram there, we saw how, I remember, for example, when the so-called peace process started in 1991 in Madrid, we had something like 75,000 settlers. 75,000 settlers. Today, there are 700,000 settlers, including East Jerusalem. There's about 500,000 in the occupied West Bank, plus around 200,000 plus in East Jerusalem. So there are unoccupied territories after 1967, some 700,000 settlers, illegal settlers, which means it doubled 10 times since 1991.
In terms of the implications and the ramifications of the ripple effect, if you like, of whatever ruling is eventually made, if it is made in favour of the UNGA case brought on behalf of the Palestinians, what kind of impact do you think is that going to have on cases that are brought before the International Criminal Court or the Human Rights Council, for example? We should specify that the ICJ is there in order to facilitate issues between states, but the International Criminal Court hears cases which are directed towards individuals. What's the knock-on effect of this going to be if it is, if the ruling goes against Israel?
Despite the fact I'm no legal scholar, but logically, right, and from the record, from history that I've read as a student of this conflict, of this issue, of this apartheid, of this occupation, is that there is a domino effect, and that there is relationship, there is synergy between one and another. Whenever one ruling comes out, it becomes precedence, and it's used on another ruling. And clearly, what we see now from the claims made by the lawyers is that, if you notice, their arguments are based on either the United Nations have come up with, United Nations resolution, Security Council, General Assembly, the 2004 non-binding court opinion, the ICJ back then, and so on and so forth. So you always build precedents and you always build arguments, and those arguments accumulate, and one argument then can help in another court over another argument. And yes, we do move from the court like the ICJ that discusses issues between states to the ICC, to the International Criminal Court, where you discuss more the responsibility, for example, of Israeli leaders, of Israeli generals who have been responsible for war crimes, where orders were given, where people died, were killed in war, that we know that was in every possible aspect of its execution was illegal. So I think Israeli leaders should worry moving forward, not that they will end up in prison or in The Hague, because they are, unfortunately, continue to be shielded by the United States, as we've heard in the arguments earlier. But I think, once again, they will be exposed more and more to local legal processes, like we've seen in Holland, like we've seen in the UK and other places before, whereby you will see more and more Israeli leaders, war criminals, being looked into, investigated, and perhaps arrested.